So, welcome everybody. This is the third talk, and the task today is to complete this whirlwind tour of the four Rūpa Jhānas. I need to recap a bit, because the same principle applies that to talk about any of the higher jhanas, the earlier ones have to be established at some point. So even though we talked about them last time, I need to recap. So the four jhanas, they form an interlinked series. They're not completely independent by a long way. The common theme is separation from everyday sensory consciousness eventually towards Jhāna consciousness. And this reaches its culmination in the fourth Rūpa Jhāna. The Samadhi and the Upekkha of the fourth Rūpa Jhāna completes the whole series of the four Rūpa Jhanas. So the first Rūpa Jhāna that we talked about last time is all about mastering attention and redirecting that attention away from sensory consciousness, away from thinking the habits of comparison and naming. We redirect it towards the breath as the meditation object. And in order to do this, meditators have to understand, first of all, how to place attention, which is vitakka, and then how to keep that going without losing the object, sustaining attention, vichara. And the first one is relatively easy. It's just like a simple mental act of attending to the number in anapanasati. But the second one, vichara, in order to maintain continuity, knowing where we are, in other words, there has to be some understanding of meaning and salience and feeling. And so the two together, vitakka and vichara, they're very similar to the two bojjhangas that we spoke about in the last series of talks, sati and dhammavichaya. So when attention is understood and when it becomes effectively automatic, the meditator begins to feel more confident. Usually a sense of contentment begins to develop because the state is less disturbed. We don't have to do so much to keep going the sensory consciousness processes. And also, more energy is released because a lot of the energy which goes into sustaining all those brain networks that underlie sensory consciousness is no longer required. So that energy is freed. And the processes of piti develop. We start to feel energy, particularly in the body. And the sensory consciousness habits, as they fade, and we feel freer from them, we normally experience some degree of contentment. And one or two people commented in the questions that they noticed that sometimes when that arises, it's difficult to actually embrace it. Almost like we shy away from feeling or trusting that happiness. A lot of that is just getting used to it. But the reason underlying it is quite interesting, because in everyday consciousness, there's a very, very deep habit of vigilance. It's related to protection, it's a deep kind of fight-flight awareness. So there's a sort of vigilance to threat. So when we start to feel happy, it's difficult initially to just trust it. There may be a risk if we let down our guard. But when you get used to it, it becomes more familiar, and we can start to trust it. So in the first Rūpa Jhāna, the dominant jhana factors are vitakka and vichara. And secondarily, secondary factors are piti, beginnings of sukha, and the moments of absorption, one-pointedness, ekaggata citta. But the key factors are vitakka and vichara. Once attention is habitual, stable, and we can just trust it will carry on, the second Rūpa Jhāna doesn't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about keeping attention going. So the second Rūpa Jhāna is all about understanding piti and feelings. In the body, it's probably more accurate to say in the body, we're aware of sensations, and in the mind, feelings. We also become much more conscious of any disturbance that interrupts or interferes with the stillness. So a lot of the second Rūpa Jhāna is getting familiar with noticing stillness, disturbance, and feeling, and eventually finding a way to lead it into a deeper stillness. Excuse me. Most of the awareness of piti, to begin with, tends to be quite exciting and also, quite powerful, because that's where a lot of the energy has gone, no longer needed for the everyday consciousness. It's freed, and we feel it in the body, just like the body is waking up. And nevertheless, there's an underlying impulse towards more stillness. A lot of that depends on the invocation at the beginning. And to do that, just by practicing, getting more familiar with the processes, the piti starts to become more better understood, and eventually becomes more stable and quietens down and becomes part of the samadhi. Even if you didn't know anything about the word passaddhi or tranquilization, it tends to be a kind of automatic process. So when we want to move to the third Rūpa Jhāna, if piti has become relatively stable, then we don't need to worry about it so much. The body becomes just part of the absorption, part of the samadhi, and the feelings and sensations become clearer. If the piti has been really stabilized, there'll be no disturbance in the body at all. So what remains is just mental feeling, happiness, and if there's any attachment to this or to feelings and sensations in the body, then it may not fully develop. But if the second Rūpa Jhāna has been sufficiently developed, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. It's a mistake to think we have to perfect every stage before going to the next. But if it's sufficiently good and the no disturbance remains in the body, then in the third Rūpa Jhāna, we experience just mental feeling, which can be completely pure, in the sense of no disturbance whatsoever. When we look at the brain study at this point, when the third Rūpa Jhāna develops, all the networks that used to be active across the brain start to quieten down, and they're replaced by a focus at the crown of the head, which goes down into the body via the brainstem. But no disturbance in all the sensory consciousness networks. And the experience of the meditator is the simple, very simple, deep satisfaction. Sometimes people call it, bliss, but actually words don't really capture it. But the main quality of it is that it's completely undisturbed. And in the texts such as the Vimuttimagga and Visuddhimagga, the experience of the meditator is described as feeling fully conscious, completely fully conscious with no doubt, no distraction, nothing left out. And if this is the first time that someone has practiced or experienced the third Rūpa Jhāna, it's fully conscious for the first time. This is the characterizing feature of the third Rūpa Jhāna. And the simile for this is the picture that came up on the flyer for this talk. This is a picture, it's a real picture, believe it or not, a whole field full of lotus flowers opening within hours, within a day or so. It's a very unusual climatic condition somewhere in Thailand a few years ago. But the simile is that the lotus flower emerges completely clean and unsullied from the murky water, rises above it. And the experience corresponding experience in the third Rūpa Jhāna is of a kind of onlooking presence. The meditator feels fully aware, vividly aware actually, fully present, but it's not the kind of consciousness of anything such as this or that. It's just presence. So this is the difference between jhana consciousness and sensory consciousness. So if the third Rūpa Jhāna is so perfect, why do we need, is there any need to practice the fourth Rūpa Jhāna? Particularly if you think, we're lay meditators, it's not a bad thing to be quite happy. So why do we need to even consider something beyond that? And it's a good point, because leading an everyday life as lay meditators is quite complex. And it's not just ourselves, we're responsible or connected to others. We have work responsibilities, family responsibilities, very different to a monk or someone meditating in a cave. So in this tradition, in lay traditions generally, there is no injunction for someone to develop the jhanas at a particular time. It depends on circumstances, it depends on a lot of conditions. One of the benefits of having a large lay sangha that we have now is that you have a lot of different examples of how people manage this, with different jobs, different family responsibilities, how people manage to balance the everyday life with the meditator's life. So there's no hurry here. Take your time, listen to others and observe how others do it. And remember that Nai Buma many times has commented that it's very important to be normal. So the fourth Rūpa Jhāna, I have to say something about it, but bear that in mind, that the conditions will determine when you want to develop it more actively. So there may come a time, for example, when you realize in your meditation that even happiness in the third Rūpa Jhāna is a disturbance, maybe a very subtle disturbance, but a disturbance nonetheless to the stillness and peace of the absorption in the third Rūpa Jhāna. This is most likely to arise at the end of a practice, while you may be staying in the stillness to fully experience it before coming out progressively back to sensory consciousness. And at that moment, an understanding might arise that there is an attachment to that happiness, no matter how subtle. And there may also arise an impulse to let go of that dependence. And the impulse is an impulse towards more complete freedom, freedom from dependence on even happiness. So it's not just stillness. There's a recognition that something is still not completely free if it depends on happiness. At that point, a meditator might choose to re-enter jhana, and if the timing and conditions are right, the experience and depth of the stillness may become free of any attachment or craving whatsoever. No longer any need even for the reward of happiness. And this develops into the pristine samadhi, depending on nothing, of the fourth Rūpa Jhāna. The main quality is freedom. Freedom from any tie whatsoever. So the characterizing factors of the fourth Rūpa Jhāna are, first of all, deep, all-encompassing samadhi, like in the third Rūpa Jhāna, a mind-body samadhi, but also to recognize the even more perfect quality of that samadhi in the fourth Rūpa Jhāna, the freedom. The other factor that's recognized alongside samadhi is upekkha, equanimity. And it's not just a kind of passive equanimity. It's rather like, the equanimity, upekkha, that develops in the Eightfold Path as one of the factors of enlightenment. It has a quality of wisdom, freedom from suffering. Now, the simile for the fourth Rūpa Jhāna is of being enveloped in a white cloth. It's a very intriguing simile. And actually, in the practices we've had at the National Centre, occasionally we practiced what this feels like. A meditator might sit in front of a group, totally enveloped in a white cloth. And we've been doing this very occasionally, not as a regular practice, on and off over the last 20 years, to try and understand what it is that's meant by that simile. Now, last year, someone, I'm pretty sure it was you, Rob, gave me a copy of a picture taken at a talk that someone had given, an ethnologist, who'd been studying practices in Laos, unusual practices in Laos. Not a very clear picture, but it's someone sitting enveloped in a kind of shroud. Now, it's a bit different to how we do it. And I think when Rob sent me this copy, you mentioned that the person who took the picture wasn't aware of the parallel to the fourth Rūpa Jhāna. And the differences to when we've tried this are that, first of all, we find that it's very important that the cloth completely envelops the body so that nothing is left uncovered. And secondly, that ideally the white cloth is not completely opaque, that there's a subtle transparency, so that the person sitting enveloped in the white cloth experiences a very intriguing kind of liminal state, aware of the outside sensory world, but also embedded inside in the jhana, world of jhana consciousness. It's a kind of neither nor experience, in a way already presaging the arupa, formless jhanas. So these teachings, fragments of teachings that come up in Cambodia, Laos and Thailand, are very interesting because they do connect to what we experience in practice, but sometimes they're not completely perfect. So before we practice, the last thing I want to mention is a few words on how we move between the jhanas. Remembering that you can't think yourself into jhana. So it's not possible to come out, think about the next jhana, and just go into it on that basis. We can't do it through ordinary thinking processes. So to talk about this, first of all, there is a difference between practicing in a group where someone takes the role of calling the changes from one stage to the next, which I'm doing in these talks, and when you're practicing on your own. So let's take the example of the first Rūpa Jhāna as an example of how to then develop the second jhana. If you're practicing on your own, you would traditionally resolve at the beginning of your practice to practice the first jhana for, say, 30 minutes or whatever. Rather like you resolve to wake up in the morning at whatever time without an alarm clock. And at that point, after that time has gone by, there's a moment of reflection, a bit like waking in the morning without the alarm clock, but it's a moment of reflection, rather like the stillness at the end of a practice. And the same thing happens if you're in a group and the group conductor sounds the bell. There's a moment of reflection on the state, on the stillness. Now that moment of reflection is very, very important and very interesting. Because the first jhana is so close to ordinary consciousness, to thinking, it's very easy, if you're not so experienced, to find yourself quickly thinking about what you've done, and then thinking also about how to develop the second Rūpa Jhāna. But at that point, if that happens, you're caught. Because if you've reverted to sensory consciousness and thinking, you have to re-establish the first Rūpa Jhāna, Vitakka and Vichara, and do the whole process again. So the task is to resist that pull back into thinking, to stay with the stillness, which is why I've been stressing so much at the end of all your practices, to stay with the stillness and really fully experience what it's like. So if you stay with that stillness, then the quality of the stillness in coming out of the first Rūpa Jhāna is firmness and stability, which are the qualities of Vitakka and Vichara. But it's just the experience. You don't think of the word Vitakka and Vichara, but you know immediately that you've established firmness and stability. And if at that point you immediately advert back into jhana, you will do so not needing to pay any attention to Vitakka and Vichara. You will know implicitly that they're there as the foundation, and you go back in to the beginnings of developing the second Rūpa Jhāna. What you will experience are all the sensations in the body, the feelings in the mind, and then you work with those and develop the second Rūpa Jhāna. And the same principle applies in going from the second to the third, or the third to the fourth. The most tricky one is actually the first, the second, because it's so vulnerable to falling back into thinking. And this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of confusion at that point among people who practice samatha and want to develop jhana. It's very easy to come out back into sensory consciousness and be quite excited at what you've experienced and overestimate what you've experienced. It's very easy to believe that you might have mastered first Rūpa Jhāna. And more so, because the mind is quite clean at that point, quite flexible and sharp, it's very easy to create experiences based on what you might have read or expectations. So sometimes a meditator might become stuck and really need the help of their teacher or the group to understand exactly where they're at, not to immediately assume too much about the experience. This is something I often do at this point. This is a wax taper practice. I can't do it online. I've thought of all sorts of ways of trying to do it live. Basically, it just doesn't work. It's impossible to get the quality of the sound when the weight drops. Many of you have seen this, but quite a lot of you haven't, probably 50-50. The candle is a beeswax candle, and as it burns down, the weights are released in turn. And as each weight drops into the bowl, there's a sharp crack. And those are the triggers, the points at which meditators move to the next jhana. There are different ways of using this practice, but I'm talking about one way to direct the sequence of practicing the jhanas, in a way to embed them. Because the candle is this sort of handmade beeswax candle, you cannot predict exactly when it will burn down to the next weight. So with your eyes closed, you can't second guess this. So there's no point in trying. So it actually is quite helpful to meditators to let go, or try to let go, of expectations. You know, if you're in a group with a teacher sounding the bell, there's still some connection to the teacher, and this could be a very subtle assumption of when the teacher will strike the bell. But in this case, it's impersonal. It's up to the candle. Maybe it's up to a few more things too. But anyway, the candle burns down. And if the meditator has completely let go of expectation, the absorption is likely to be quite deep. You know, it's a matter of letting go of expectations of time and space. And so it allows you really to let go of even more complication and just settle into deeper and deeper samadhi. When the weight drops, there's a sharp crack which breaks the stream of consciousness very fast. One moment you're in samadhi, the next moment you are brought back to the very threshold of samadhi. And the same task arises to resist any pull back into thinking about it. Basically what's happening in terms of, for example, Abhidhamma theory, is that you remain at the threshold of jhana. You might call it upachara samadhi. If you've been practicing the first Rūpa Jhāna, then you recognize the quality of stability. You then immediately advert back in, and you will automatically be developing the next jhana, and so on through the series. At the end of the second Rūpa Jhāna, the crack breaks your stream of consciousness, you immediately recognize in the stillness that the body is perfectly calm, no more disturbance, assuming you've developed the second Rūpa Jhāna sufficiently. You immediately advert back in, and it will be on the basis of developing the next jhana, the third Rūpa Jhāna, and so on. So the process is actually very simple and very quick. Having done it with something like the wax taper practice is very helpful for a meditator, then going back to our individual practice and having still that sense of how to do that, how to let go in that way, and just rely on the adhitthana, the determination at the beginning to end whichever jhana it is, and then quickly experience the quality and then advert into the next one. So we can't do it online in real life, but we can imagine something like that process. And bear that in mind when I sound the bell to, in your own way, try out what I was just suggesting. So when we practice, I'll sound the bell to start, and then I'll sound the bell the first time after to move from the first to the second Rūpa Jhāna, the next bell from the second to the third, the next from the third to the fourth, and then the final bell to end the practice. If you lose track of where you're at, don't worry. Just imagine letting go of whatever complication there might be and just go back in. And you will almost certainly connect to where we're at. And then at the end of the practice, in the usual way, stay with the stillness. And if anything comes to mind, feel free to share it with the group. And no one needs to respond until several people have maybe made a contribution, and then we'll see where it goes. So start practice. Okay, so if anything comes to mind, feel free to voice it. Don't worry about whether you think it's relevant or not. It's bound to be. No need for anyone to respond. Then someone else might want to contribute something. And then another person, and another person, and perhaps a theme might arise.
I just wanted to say at one point there was enormous heat, and then it felt like there was a hair, and I've had this before, like a hair on the left-hand side in my throat. And I've sometimes wondered whether that represents something, like just something slightly stuck in the throat, and then it seemed to, I wasn't aware of it then, so it went, but that was it.
Mm-hmm. You said, Anne, you said enormous what?
Heat. I felt really, yeah, I've had it, I did a practice this morning as well enough. Sometimes this heat can come even when I'm not practicing, when something, like something quite fundamental insight to you, insight's too big a word, but something fundamental truth is coming, and this is enormous heat right through my body.
Do you mean feet as in foot?
No, heat, temperature, high temperature.
Okay.
Interesting. Maybe I need some more feet.
Yeah, I was sort of wondering a bit about the changes in stages in the practice, and that sense of sort of knowing where one is, or potentially being pulled back into something, and the sort of the parallel actually with the in and out breath. So sort of end of the in breath to the out breath, and vice versa, because it often seems like there's something sort of parallel happening there. That there's a sort of a place where the mind can sort of continue and rest in that state, or actually can sort of be pulled off, or sort of move back into something. So it seemed to me, just sort of thinking about it, and from the last practice, that there was possibly a parallel there between those things.
You mean a parallel between the process of changing from the in to the out breath and the out breath to the in breath, and changing between the jhanas?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what I was wondering about, because the way you described it earlier, it seemed like there was something parallel happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had an interesting experience today, Paul, because I slightly misunderstood your instruction. I thought that you were going to ring a bell as it were at each change through the 4 jhanas. And so I was, for a long time, I was just, as it were, peacefully, as it were, resting in the first stage, just waiting, waiting, and waiting, and thinking, okay, what's happening here? Maybe my computer's not working, maybe. So then I went into kind of worrying and thinking, and at some point I just thought, actually, don't worry about it. And it was like going back into the taper wax practice. Just, it's okay. And it was really, really helpful to just let go of the, as to where the needing, it's like there's a part that needs to be in control as to what stage I'm in, or what place I'm in, or where am I in, or location and time and space. And there was something about the uncertainty, which initially was disconcerting, but actually the uncertainty then became a kind of freedom to just rest with whatever was. It was really, really interesting.
So you think you misunderstood my instruction?
Okay.
Just the same experience for me. I was expecting the bell, and I had similar experiences to Charles, a little bit of worry, what was happening. But I just let go as well. I decided, well, it doesn't matter. And when I let go, a lot of piti came up. I had a lot of energy in the body. It was very, very interesting. And then it was just a beautiful, deep practice after that. And I completely let go of all expectation. So it was quite similar anyway to the candle taper practice. Yeah. So are you saying you did that deliberately, Paul?
No, very, very strange, you know, how these things happen. What I said at the beginning was what I intended. Then, when 30 minutes passed and I picked up the bell, at that moment I realized I had not sounded the bell at all. And I wondered what that was about. And now I know what it was about.
It was a very interesting exploration of kind of how my mind, and perhaps Aileen, you're saying the same, moves to worry and concern, but out of it. And it's actually not a big step. You sometimes think, oh gosh, I need a long process to move out of my everyday kind of worrying and checking and concern. Actually, it wasn't very complicated. It was just, okay, do I go to the right or do I go to the left? You know, it was very straightforward. And
I'd like to actually add to what people have been saying because it feels very appropriate. I couldn't get into to hear Paul's talk this morning. I got to the point where waiting for the host is waiting to let you in, but nothing happened, and I waited for about half an hour. Then I actually emailed somebody, and then I got a link back, and then eventually I got in, and it must have been in the middle of the meditation. And there's that place of me thinking, oh shit, oh God, it's not worth it, so just go up, go off, sign off. But I stayed, and I thought, okay, I'll see what I can do. And it's that kind of place of, I could feel that kind of frustration and anger coming up in me, and sort of thinking, for me it goes, oh, it's a waste of time, and want to trash it, to reject it. It's no good, it's not going to happen. And there's another part of me saying, oh, hold on, just you're here now, just see what happens. And I sort of started the meditation with the counting, and I could feel there was a process I was starting to enter, I was starting to settle, because I knew something was releasing in me, because I yawned and I yawned and I yawned. And that's usually part of my process of settling my energy and sort of coming more present. So I was quite surprised that was happening as quickly as it did. So it was worth being here. Okay, I'll sign off now. I can say something. I was reminded of the sheer power of intention, just setting that intention to go from bell to bell, whatever that may be. And it was surprising for me as well. I decided we were probably going to do a 2-hour practice or something today, and that was fine actually for me this morning. It was okay. But just at home, just that, and I wondered if it related to invocation. Now, I wasn't at some of the previous talks, but that sort of invoking something in yourself to set something up and just go there in a very simple way seemed to me this morning to be extremely powerful.
I would say also on that vein, when we started, I was very aware of the sensory world, because I'd opened a window because it's very warm here, and there was a lot going on out there. There was people throwing things into a skip, there was somebody else doing some maintenance work with a big heavy duty machine, traffic driving back and forth, and I'd made this resolution that I wasn't going to get drawn to any of it. And it was a little difficult at first. But actually, I don't remember anything about it afterwards. It just went. I wasn't aware of all that noise and busyness out there. So, yeah, I think it was the power of just making that intention, really, at the beginning.
I just wanted to add that from the comments, it really brought to mind the beautiful picture of the lotus flower, of coming up from the uncertainty, coming up from the noise of the skip and the bitterness, that the beauty of the flower came.
Yeah.
Nicola?
I had a similar experience to Charles and those who said that as well, about expecting. Then the letting go happened, and just wanted to say what I observed when the bell rang. There was just this real resonance, and I noticed the sense of smell. And it sort of touched something with an innocence. The smell reminded me of something of my childhood, and I've just felt it was. I felt almost like cleansed. There was a real sort of peace and cleansing, because as the bell went, I just spent time observing my feelings, and it felt very, very cleansed and calm.
I felt not ringing the bell has really helped me to develop the stillness much better than ringing the bell, and which would have disturbed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wasn't expecting the ringing even.
That's very interesting. You know, I think giving these talks online rather than in front of people on a retreat, first the Bhujanga talks and now these, has been a really interesting experience, and learning things that hadn't fully realized before about the connection between people practicing meditation, being something not limited to being face to face in the same room. And that is something that just is, you know. I don't feel any particular urge to try to rationalize it or think it, but it just certainly is. I think a lot of it to do with trust. And so I noticed the same thing happening with the Bhujanga talks, that once you commit to a series of looking at something, in that case the Bhujangas, and in this case the Yogāvacara, it's rather similar to walking on a path, that already at the beginning there's something about the whole process is understood at some level. And if there's a degree of trust in that, then it's possible to let go of the personal component that might otherwise control things. So the same thing with the Bhujanga talks. It's something to do with starting with the beginning, an invocation. And there's already a direction set up. This is just the third, towards understanding something about the path, the Buddhist path, which is so closely linked to the Jhānas and the Bhujangas. But something is actually understood by everyone committing to listen to these talks. And for me, as being part of that in the kind of conducting, to some extent, the talk. But even I am not completely in control of the process. So when I came to sound the final bell, only at that moment was I aware that I hadn't sounded the bell before. And at the same time, understood something that was probably what was needed. Something to do with letting go and trusting, and like you just said, about anything that interferes with that can be a bit of an obstruction. And who is it who controls that process? It's not me. It's something to do with the collective endeavor, you know, which is really interesting to see. You know, I think one of the most powerful things we are dealing with is the whole idea of control and expectation. Because the everyday consciousness that we live within is completely consumed with maintaining some kind of continuity and control of sensory input, memory, possible actions, all of which links into our superficial sense of I. It gives a time continuity to I am, I exist, as Paul Dennison, or I do, from a moment just past to the present to the next one. All that is going on all the time. So to practice as we just did, where there's nothing to hang on to, you know, when nothing comes as a marker, to let go of time. And you find that actually it's not a frightening place. It's very free once you accept it. And the fact that time is no longer a concern means that it's immense. You know, the field of experience is just immense. So we just finished the 4 Rūpa Jhānas, which is then very interesting because the next stage is exactly letting go of that control of time and space into the formless jhanas. So something in the practice just now almost automatically arises that gives us a sense of where we're headed, what we're touching on. Something which is like the 4th Rūpa Jhāna, increasingly free, and then in the Arūpa Jhānas, without any limits. Also, you know, it's very interesting that even though you may not feel you're in a good place to practice meditation, it may be exactly the right time, place to practice meditation. And to let go of that assumption is also interesting.
Yeah. Yes, Paul, I was thinking that I got a bit lost like the others, and I thought I'd made a mistake or turned the sound off wrongly, but in the end I just relaxed and perhaps felt it wasn't as deep a practice as I'd intended it to be. That's what happened, but on reflection I think I depend on the structure so much, really. And we do have a very structured practice, you know, as well. And I felt that was one of the distinctive features of our practice, that there's clear stages and distinctive aspects. And when we get to these more refined stages, the distinctions aren't perhaps so clear until you develop them. But it made me wonder whether actually unstructured is also valid, you know, or is equally valid, you know. I've tended to sort of think once you've lost the structure, you've lost the whole thing somehow. And but reflecting on it, I perhaps could have made more of that unstructured and trusted it a bit more, and sort of, what is it, not sunk into it, but, you know, totally allow myself to be in it. But it's that judgment, isn't it? When would I do an unstructured practice? When would I keep to the structure? I just thought I'd mention that.
Well, I think what you described is you're already touching on that boundary, you know, where at the middle of 6 talks, we've been talking about the Rūpa Jhānas, and the next stage is to let go of structure completely into Arūpa Jhāna. Mm. So there's a very good reason why the jhanas deal first with form, and then, only then, to fully understand form, to be able to let go of that structure. Otherwise, it could be quite frightening. But the interface between the two, first Rūpa, then Arūpa, then also Arūpa will teach you more about Rūpa, until finally, you know, you start to wonder, what is the reality between the two?
Look forward to it.
Yeah, kind of related to that. Just recently, I found myself in one of the Rūpa Jhāna levels, and after a while of being in that level with a certain breath length, I've just thought, let it be as it is, just being present. The breath length might alter, so I can just kind of relaxing into it, just as you might be if you're walking up a hill by a path that you know, but then you get to a point and you just stop and be present as it is there. And then having done that for a while, then might go back to the structure and maybe alter the breath length and settling. And then after a while in that, just relax into it. So structure, unstructured, structure, unstructured.
I'm interested in the reference to the structure, because I know we have this 16 stage structure, but it has seemed to me very much that I've thought of it as a structure that just reflects a natural process that, touching on those different jhanas, it's a process that actually sort of feels as if it happens naturally, without necessarily, given the right conditions, without having to necessarily have that structure or to make conscious intentions. But I'm just wondering now if that seems now like a natural process because of working with the structure so much. So I don't know if you see what I mean. So it's a question mark, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In regards to the structure, because of the bell, it meant that I went into practice straight away, so that came very quickly, but I stayed in the counting, so I stayed there for ages. And then sort of the word letting go of complication and trust was just the big thing. So there was nothing coming, but I still went into the following at a certain point. And I felt that the sort of, in terms of developing that, the jhana, the first jhana, that was happening there. It was like working with the practice, working with the breath, in a way with much more intention in choosing not to be complicated and not to think about it, but just, and yet still to have intention. It's funny to be not thinking, to be not complicated, and yet I was aware of intention and to cultivate and to develop. So yeah. And so when people mentioned, I thought, maybe I've missed the bell, or maybe I've done this, or maybe done that, that didn't come up for me. And I got through to a certain point, and I think I'd got into this sort of settling stage, and I'd already sort of, it was strange to have the structure sort of crossing over. And at the end, when you rang the bell and I realised, something's gone different here, there was like a slight arising of a feeling, which I was about to label as something like I've done something wrong, or something, or I've missed something. Except it wasn't. And when I let it be, it was just a bit like Nicola said, a certain opening and a certain softness that was there, actually, in fact.
I think what you're describing is as well that how pervasive the habit of thinking is. Even though we've got a structure, as Jackie mentioned, 16 stages, progressive stages, counting, following, touching, settling, longest, longer, shorter, shortest, length of breath. Even though we've got that structure, which one way of looking at it is that it helps us to move to more subtle stages in the practice. Even then, to let go of the habits of thinking and recognition, knowing where you are, all those habits of sensory consciousness is a big challenge, and often it's we only realize after a long time that we've still been doing it. Not 100% maybe. I mean, there may be times that arise when you let go of some of it, but it's still, what you're describing is realizing that there's a touch of it that remains for a long, long time. And then when you start to let go of that, it's like an anchor. It's like a security to know that by thinking and the sense of time. When we let it go, then it's quite a breakthrough to realize that you can trust the process. And that's partly what you're describing, and I think it happens to many meditators, that it's a surprise to realize just how much we still are caught up in thinking and trying to formulate something and not entirely trusting, just letting go. I think partly also it's a bigger problem for us in a kind of Western culture, where there's a lot of emphasis on thinking, on cognitive processes, compared to, for example, in Thailand, in rural areas, you know, where people are much more on a feeling level. So I can remember seeing in one particular temple where we were visiting to take part in the some ceremony. They didn't have enough monks. And just in front of where we were sitting, there was a row of novices, temple boys, maybe half a dozen. And they'd been temple boys for 2 or 3 years. You know, you can't take the full ordination till you're 20. So they were probably in their teens, ranging from young teens up to 15, 16. And of course, that's how Nai Buman started. He was a village ruffian, and then he became a temple boy, and his life took a different direction. Anyway, this particular monastery had 1 or 2 monks who specialized in very evocative forms of chanting that kind of very hypnotic, very powerful, and very cleverly attuned to the energy, piti, in the body. It kind of carried you away. You know, you may have come across it sometimes with some of the samatha chanting, like the Pika Tripitaka chant, for example, or the transcendent Jhāna chant. Anyway, I was remember looking at this group of temple boys, and they were listening to the chant and they were taking part in the chant, and they were just lighting up with piti. They were somehow just allowing themselves to completely merge with the chanting and the feeling. And they may have probably known nothing about the detailed technique of meditation, but they were just dropping into a state which was extremely peaceful, joyful, and with no expectation, just in it, you know, just naturally, completely on a feeling level. And some people can do it just like that, you know, just go in that way. We sometimes think too much, and it's very difficult to let that go. Mind you, there's a disadvantage the other way around. You know, people, for example, who practice Buddha practice, which is very popular still in Thailand, often get a sense of jhana very quickly. and get carried away in a way by the excitement and the joyfulness of it, and find it incredibly difficult to let go of that attachment and develop any further.
Hello. Just on that point, for me, I've been very aware of that throughout settling, of how that marries together, and it's something, and that's where I think another kind of structure for me over the last few months has been very useful. That is to say, it doesn't, something like, for me it's been the 4 foundations of mindfulness. For others it might be something else, but there needs to be some way of marrying them together. And as that process of going through 4 jhanas arises, in other words, some way of carrying your head with you, as well as that instinctive feeling, and without the judging and labeling, or the sanya, whatever you want to call them, but nevertheless, the head and the understanding being fully present. And for me, that maybe that's where, that's where, when we do study groups and things like that, is very interesting, because we can find qualities, which come up that we relate to. And I was thinking what Nabuman's teaching of find your favorite practice, and that, how much that is, how lovely that is, as well as what's your favorite Dhamma. And actually that favorite Dhamma is very interesting to follow the nose with that, and actually because it's there as a support too. And the other thing, just to come back to the sense of structure, and I know I have said this before, but I find it still to be true, is that I love the 16 stages, and in the sense that they're really there as a ladder of support, and I had occasion recently of having to, in a hospital situation where I had a loss of losing the sense of the breath, because I was on a ventilator. It wasn't coronavirus, but it's still very strongly with me, and that sense of, I realise what it was now when I look back on it, that there were conversations going on about, they were trying to take this ventilator out of me. I was fully conscious, and I could hear them saying things like, "Oh, she's not breathing," and I thought, well, in that case, I must be dead, but I can't be dead because I can hear them. So what am I doing? Oh, I must be doing a Rūpa, that's all. They just get interested in the breath or whatever. And then I realised that what was happening was, it's very easy when you've had a big tube inside you. I think I probably realised this in retrospect afterwards, to rely on that tube, and it becomes very difficult to and so you need something else to get you breathing again in a funny sort of way. And that was when I realised that 16 stages was incredible, because it taught me how to move, although it may not have been consciously, from shortest to shorter to longer to longest. I had a structure by which to really work with breathing again, and breathing coming back fully into my body. And I'm not saying this to sort of frighten anybody with a daft experience, but what I learned from it was that just because the structure, the difference between visible and invisible, that just because the structure isn't there doesn't mean it isn't there, and that all the years we have of doing our practice, of developing these stages, and there may be a time, and I think part of the process is handing over and letting go and going into nothingness, or going into whatever else it is, or emptiness, or whatever you want to call it, and letting the breath do what it likes. it's all about the relationship between exploring and being creative with that, but knowing, in other words, having embodied the experience of the 16 stages. So your body knows you have those stages present. You don't need this to tell you that you've got them. You know, that was, for me, that was a real experience, which really took me in an extreme situation. But I feel it's relevant. That's why I'm mentioning it here now. I feel it's sort of, it's a very helpful. Having a structure is a good thing. And it's learning how to play with that structure. So,
I think what came to mind for me is the discussion Paul was giving about integrating PT and how we talk about sensations in the body, and then there's a move to mental feeling. And seems really interesting today, a lot of comments about sort of how to allow that process to happen, in that when things are happening in the body, I find for myself, you can enjoy that aspect, but then the mental side isn't quite joined to that. So you can still make a kind of little story about what it is, or why it's important, or how it relates to a particular stage or whatever. But there's something about allowing the feeling into the mental world, which is, it feels kind of, it's at that point that the self really gets quite challenged, because the feeling it's almost like the feeling dissolves the kind of the thinking side of things. But that's quite you don't actually have to do too much for that to happen. So I don't know, just that kind of transition point between physical feeling and mental feeling seems really interesting somehow. And like others have been saying, you don't actually have to do too much to let that happen, but there has to be a kind of recognition that there's still a kind of gap there between the physical and the mental, that it's almost as soon as you allow something to happen, that can be bridged in some way. And the mental feeling is kind of similar to the physical, but to me it almost had the quality of like a joke today. Like when it goes into the mental realm, everything becomes like some kind of a joke because the taking the self seriously can't happen in the same way. So I hadn't really thought about it before as kind of the practice being a joke, but that's what it felt like.
Because you can't take yourself as seriously in the same way. Yeah.
I was just interested in what Paul was saying about the ways of moving from one jhana to another. And I know that's something, well, I find that quite often when I'm doing a meditation, the jhanas they just go. If I step back, they just sort of not blend into each other, but they move from one to another. And I feel I'm quite happy with that, because I feel that they go at the right time for me, that they've reached a certain point of development, and that they change at what feels like the right time. And I've always sort of felt like at some point I need to get more of a control over this and set myself times and be able to go from one to another and all that. But whenever it actually comes down to it, I just feel that they move at the right time. And I just wondered what Paul would say about the conflict there. And I suppose it's best to be able to do both, is it?
I think everyone's got slightly different temperaments, and the jhana, the qualities of the jhanas are to some extent there to some degree in all the jhanas, in the different mix. And it may be that what you're describing is your way of getting familiar with what it feels like. What does it look like? What does it feel like in your experience without actually going to the point of complete absorption in any of the jhanas, which is okay. There's no hurry. And then you may come to a point where you get a bit clearer about exactly where you are. And for example, when I suggest staying with the stillness at the end of a practice, don't forget to do that, because if you come out and you just stay with the stillness without thinking, gradually you get a sense of where you've been. You know, is it mostly connected with like the qualities of attention and solidity, and like in Vitakka and Vichara, or is it more connected with feelings in the body, or is it more connected with feelings in the mind, or is it empty of feeling? You know, if you stay with the stillness, you start to understand more clearly what the jhana factors are. Then at some point you will find that in a practice, you almost automatically go a bit deeper. You know, because you've realized something bit by bit, you'll find yourself going deeper and deeper into more and more stillness without fearing it, without needing to move around mentally. You can trust it, you go deeper. And then when you come out and stay with the stillness, then you'll understand where you've been, whether it's the first Rūpa Jhāna or the second. So I think what you're describing is just your way of doing it. Sometimes you have to just follow your instinct. And there's nothing wrong with what you're describing. You know, there'll be somewhere in it, there'll be an overall direction towards understanding and trusting the process, and then going towards more stillness. You start to notice there's the in-breath, the out-breath, there's a stillness, and then there may be a nimitta, and then gradually it just gets more and more simple, more and more still. The breath becomes part of it, and you just allow it to go deeper. So I think it's a good point maybe to finish on, 12 o'clock. So I'm going to sign off. And the next talk is next Saturday on the first and second Rūpa Jhānas.
Final small thought. We now have a samatha koan. What is the sound of no bell ringing?